Joining me now to talk about this and much more is former Democratic presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Senator, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So the North Koreans put out a statement denouncing what it called the Trump administration's, quote, maniacal military provocations, including the deployment of the aircraft carrier. During the campaign, you called North Korea the greatest threat to the U.S. How do you think President Trump has dealt with the crisis so far?
Well, the important point is how we go forward. It is a very complicated and difficult issue. You have a regime which in North Korea is isolated, which has put incredible resources into a nuclear and missile program while millions of its people over the years have starved to death. The key point here is that the United States must not act impulsively, and we must not act unilaterally. The key, I think, to this situation, and I think President Trump understands this, is dealing with China. China now receives about 80% of the imports of North Korea. They are virtually the only ally that North Korea has. And what China has got to understand is that they have got to put incredible pressure, work with the entire Asian community in telling North Korea that they have got to cease their efforts in developing intercontinental ballistic missiles and more nuclear weapons. I think China has the capability of doing that. So the partnership with China and other countries in that region is what we have got to focus on.
And as you note, President Trump has seemed to follow that basic idea that China is the key. After he met with Chinese President Xi, an editorial in a semi-official Chinese newspaper warned North Korea specifically that it must rein in its nuclear ambitions or risk losing vital Chinese trade. It wrote, quote, Chinese society will be willing to see the United Nations Security Council adopt severe restrictive measures that have never been seen before, such as restricting oil imports to the north. It seems to be something of a policy shift for China. Do you agree? And if so, do you think President Trump's policy of leading on China is the reason this is happening?
No, I think this policy shift on the part of China has been taking place for quite a while now. As I understand it, for example, China did not have a representative at the military parade in North Korea the other day. That says something. Just the other day, the plane trips between Beijing and North Korea were suspended. Not to mention that China is now cutting back on the importation of coal from North Korea, which is the major source of their foreign currency. But China has got to do a lot more, a lot more. They have got to be working with the United States, with Japan, with South Korea to make it very clear to North Korea that these policies cannot continue, or else there is going to be significant economic sanctions destroying that economy.
You were one of the only members of Congress to come out opposed to the strike in Syria 2 Thursdays ago. You warned it could lead to a quagmire. Now, since that time, there have been no further U.S. strikes against the Syrian regime. President Trump said this week, quote, we're not going into Syria. Is it possible that that airstrike by the U.S. was a one-off?
Well, here is the point. Jake, when we talk about national disasters, what is happening in Syria is almost beyond belief. You have a dictator there who appears prepared to destroy his entire country in order to hold on to his power and his wealth. 400,000 Syrians are dead, 10 million people are displaced. They have detainment camps, massive torture. They bomb hospitals. This is a horrific regime. What our job there has got to, again, not act unilaterally. In this case, we have got to demand that Russia and Iran stop their efforts in supporting this horrific dictator. Assad has got to go. ISIS has got to be defeated. But I do not want to see the United States get sucked into perpetual warfare in the Middle East, see our men and women get killed, trillions of dollars being spent. We've been in Afghanistan now for over 15 years. We've been in Iraq for a very long time. I don't want to see us dragged into another war in Syria when kids in this country cannot afford to go to college, when our infrastructure is collapsing, when 28 million Americans have no health insurance. We have got to start paying attention to the needs back home, work with allies in the region. The war in Iraq was the worst blunder in the modern history of this country, precipitated mass instability. We cannot continue to make those mistakes. Countries around the world have got to work with us to address those crises.
Senator, Arab leaders and former Obama administration officials applauded the strike by President Trump against Assad's forces. They said it was exactly what you're talking about, a way to send a signal to him that what his behavior is unacceptable while not getting the U.S. involved in a quagmire. So I'm not exactly sure why you oppose the strike. Can you help clear it up for us?
Well, and listen, it's not a question of one strike or one big bomb in Afghanistan. What you need is a strategy. And that strategy has got to demand that Russia, which supplies an enormous amount of very sophisticated weaponry to Assad, stop what it's doing. This will require intensive negotiations to tell Russia that they cannot support a dictator who is destroying his entire country. One strike is not going to do very much in that process.
Senator, in addition to that Berkeley protest, Democrats across the country yesterday gathered for rallies all over on tax day, calling for President Trump to release the last 10 years of his tax returns and disclose any foreign conflicts of interest. Now, I've heard that many Democratic senators believe that the president's tax returns could be subpoenaed in the course of the Senate Intelligence Committee investigation into Russian meddling in the U.S. election. Do you think his returns should be subpoenaed?
I think the American people need to understand what kind of involvement Trump's business dealings have abroad and what kind of leverage those dealings may have on his policies as President of the United States. They want a president who's going to represent the American people, not his own interests, business interests, which extend all over the world. But, you know, Jake, when you talk about planes, as I think you know, tomorrow afternoon, Tom Perez, who's the chair of the Democratic Party, and I will be taking a 9-state tour all across this country to do what I think is absolutely necessary, and that is to help revitalize American democracy. So many of our people are giving up on the political process. It is very frightening. In the last presidential election, when Trump won, we had the lowest voter turnout in 20 years. And in the previous 2 years before that, in the midterm election, we had the lowest voter turnout in 70 years. And I think what's happening is the middle class shrinks as people perceive that the media and Congress is not hearing their pain about a declining standard of living, income and wealth inequality, not being able to afford to send their kids to college. They're giving up on the political process. And we cannot allow that to happen. So Tom and I are going to be going all over this country. We're going to be fighting to see that the Democratic Party becomes a 50-state party. You can't just be a West Coast party and an East Coast party. And we need a bottom-up party, a grassroots party, which is prepared to stand up to the big money interests, which have so much influence over the political and economic development of our country.
Well, let's talk about that. Kansas and Georgia are red states. You're on this red state tour that's going to kick off tomorrow. But just this week, a Democrat you supported lost an election for a special House seat election in Kansas. A Democratic candidate, Jon Ossoff, is seeking to fill in Georgia a seat vacated by the now Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary Dr. Tom Price in Georgia. Are you concerned that the DNC, they're doing this big red state tour with you, but a lot of people criticized the DNC for not sending enough resources to Kansas. So it's great that they're doing this display.
Let's be clear.
Okay,
let's be clear. I mean, the point here is that I think all over grassroots America, whether they're Democrats, independents, or Republicans, people are perceiving that Trump did not tell the truth in his campaign in terms of what he would do as president of the United States. He was going to drain the swamp. Well, he's in fact appointed more billionaires to his cabinet than any president in history, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think has happened now in Kansas, it is true that the Democratic candidate lost. It is true that the Democratic Party should have put more resources into that election. But it is also true that he ran 20 points better than the Democratic candidate for president did in Kansas. So what you're seeing in Kansas, what you're seeing in Georgia, I believe you're going to see it in Montana. I believe you're going to see it all over this country, is that many so-called red states, working people are going to wake up and say, wait a second, Republicans want to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and education, and they want to give hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1%. No, that's not what we elected Trump to do. Yeah, climate change is real. It's not a hoax. We got to move to sustainable energy. I think all over this country, in red states and in blue states, people are beginning to stand up. They're beginning to fight back. They're demanding a government which does not just represent the billionaires, but represents the working class of this country.
Senator, I want to ask you about this horrific incident last week in which a passenger was dragged off a United flight after refusing to give up his seat voluntarily. Democratic Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky of Illinois, she's planning to introduce legislation that would ban airlines from being able to involuntarily bump passengers from flights. Airlines say that this kind of congressional meddling could result in much higher fares for consumers. What do you think Congress should do?
Well, I think anybody who flies a lot, and as a United States Senator, I fly a lot, knows how dysfunctional in many respects the airlines are. They know that there are many, many delays that are caused not because of weather, but because of inappropriate practices on the part of the airlines. This overbooking, which caused this particular problem, is not unique. I've been on airlines many, many times where people have been asked to leave. And I think what we do need is to take a hard look at the airlines in this country and make them much more responsive to the consumers than they currently are in terms of pricing. I mean, you could have two people on an airline, one paying twice as much as another person. So the idea of taking a hard look at airline travel, and by the way, the consolidation of ownership in the airline industry is something that I think would be a very useful effort.
All right, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, thank you so much. Have fun and good luck on your red state tour.
Thank you very much.